smokes, it's more of You're All Doomed, the podcast that typically goes through Friday the 13th movies 13 minutes at a time. I'm Greg, and I may or may not be played by Vincent DeSanti.
And I'm Cursed Brian.
And this time we're going to be covering the fan film Jason Rising, which was released in August of 2021. The biggest surprise for me up front was that it looks like Womp Stomp has something to do with this movie. Womp Stomp is, of course, Vincent DeSanti's production company that put together the Never Hike Alone movies. And so I was surprised to see them involved.
Exactly. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that either. And so, and we'll get to this later too, but there's an even bigger Womp Stomp connection later on. But yeah, it was interesting to see that they were producing other fan films, which I think is kind of cool, and not just their own.
Yeah, that was great. It's also apparently produced by Red Crow Films in association with Hot Carl Films, and I laughed out loud because, as much as I love Friday the 13th movies, but even more, I love shitty workplace training videos. And for several years at my old company, we had sexual harassment training every 6 months or every year or so, and it was always with this one character. He wasn't even an actor. He was just clip art, where it was this very stern, disappointed looking African American gentleman with no legs, meaning they just cropped the photo with no legs, and he was always making these disapproving expressions on his face or pointing whenever they would be showing us the important information. And so, I mean, as terrible as sexual harassment in the workplace is, the videos themselves were so entertaining that we named him Hot Carl.
Oh, nice. Yeah, when I saw Hot Carl, I immediately thought of some, and this just tells you where my mind goes, but it just sounds like some euphemism for a sexual position, or it's hey, have you done a Hot Carl before?
I mean, you know what that is, right?
No.
Oh, a Hot Carl is when you put plastic wrap over your partner's face and then take a shit.
You're kidding, right?
Nope.
So I just laid that up for you.
And I slam dunked it, no pun intended.
That's well, in that case, yeah, I have done a few Hot Carls in my lifetime. That's crazy.
Well, I'm glad you can come to this podcast and learn a little something.
Well, which one of the big comedians has a production company? I don't know if it's Sandler or maybe even Will Ferrell, but Dirty Sanchez.
Right.
Oh, it might be the the Anchorman dudes.
Yeah, I think it's those guys.
Yeah, and so yeah, I just assumed I just had a dirty mind. It was I bet Hot Carl is something, but I had no idea.
Oh, it is. Oh, it is.
And I'm glad I didn't look it up myself. It's so much more interesting to hear it from you.
Don't do the Google image search, whatever you do.
So the first thing we see basically is a little, a chyron of just the definition of a curse. And it's nothing we haven't seen before in terms we know what a curse is, but just kind of setting it up front that there's going to be a larger curse element to this movie, and just wanted to kind of plant that seed now to kind of have an ongoing discussion to see if they really kind of dove into that enough, or if they could have done something more. Because personally, when I saw it, I was expecting something different than what we got. And so that's why I just wanted to bring it up to kind of, if you weren't already, just to kind of start thinking about how that ends up getting utilized.
Or not.
Right.
Yeah. We also get a voiceover, which explains that this introductory scene is a flashback that takes place after the events of Part 4. And we even get an overhead shot of Jason in the hockey mask laying on the ground, which doesn't line up with the events of Part 4 at all. We'll see that they're playing a little bit loose with continuity in this fan film.
They do, because there's a few, even just right here in the beginning, there's a few things that set up that hey, we are in that universe that everyone's familiar with, but then there's things that just don't necessarily add up. And the first one is what you mentioned, Greg, which is just Jason laying in the field. That's not how we left him. But I did like the narration, and I know it's nothing special. It's basically just campfire tale told in a different environment, but there was something about just getting this quick narration of, the cursed town, Jason, the legend of Jason, how many people he killed. And I don't know if it was just the guy's voice or what, but it set a very different tone for me, where we've gotten voiceovers before. We've gotten people sitting around campfires telling the legend of Jason, but for whatever reason, this particular delivery, it just was very kind of comfortable in a way. It was just like, like, I kind of like this. Like, I'm settling in. I'm like, all right, I kind of like where this is going. And and I liked the first appearance of Jason. I thought he looked really good. It was classic Jason, even though where he was didn't really line up with where we remembered seeing him at the end of final chapter. But just right from the beginning, I thought, all right, I'm on board.
Yeah, we'll talk more about Jason's appearance in this one a little bit, as we go. But I agree. I thought it's a really good representation of the like Richard Brooker, Ted White era of Jason, and I like that he's not wearing some sort of LL Bean outfit. It's just kind of those like work pants and like a like a dirty old shirt. It's just it's good classic Jason.
The only important, or I would say the most important thing to pull from the narration is that the narrator is telling the story as it was told to him by his father. And that is about to be set up in the next scene, but we at least know that the narrator is the son of this particular person who had direct contact with with Jason, or at least the investigation of the crimes.
And we get a police vehicle pulling up to a gate next to the old standby Camp Crystal Lake sign. So drinking game, take a shot, establishing that we're back on familiar territory. But again, like the events of the final chapter didn't take place at Camp Crystal Lake. They took place at the Jarvis house. So whatever. We're introduced to a sheriff and a couple of deputies. And the sheriff has like the largest mustache I've ever seen outside of the Kenneth Branagh Hercule Poirot movies. It's insane.
From this point on, I refer to him as Sheriff Mustache in my notes.
Absolutely. They basically begin digging a huge hole for some reason. They're on this like kind of flatbed pickup truck, and there's a large box in the back of the truck, and they appear to be getting ready to bury something. And they happen to mention that Tommy Jarvis found his mother dead in the tub. So we do then get kind of semi-canonical confirmation that Mrs. Jarvis died. Although, I mean, that whole thing, even like that was a deleted scene from part 4. And that whole thing always struck me as strange because she was outside when she was apparently killed. So then what, Jason like lugged her upstairs, filled the tub, and like, I see why the filmmakers of this movie put that detail in. Fair enough. It's referencing something that was at least originally intended to be in part 4. But that never made sense to me, even back when it was just a deleted scene.
Mm-hmm. The only explanation for that would have been maybe if they had kept that tub scene in the movie, we would not have gotten the scene of Mrs. Jarvis outside being chased or screaming or whatever. Maybe. But yeah, that was something that popped into my head. And then another thing, I actually had to rewind it and listen to it again, because I think they actually say, because there's something like, did you see how shook it up that Jarvis kid was? And it was like, well, yeah, wouldn't you be the same way if you found your mom dead in the tub? And when I first heard it, it sounded like they said mom and dad in the tub. and I didn't go in that direction. Like, I did assume that they were both found dead in the tub, but I was like, wait, now Mr. Jarvis died in the tub? I'm like, I don't remember that. Yeah. So then I had
Tommy walked in on them. They were in the tub and they were doing a hot Carl. And that's why he's so shaken up. No child should ever have to see his parents doing that.
So then he turned around to go to his bathroom, shaved his head, and went downstairs and killed Jason.
Exactly.
But yes, it was just referencing that deleted scene, which, again, this is just one of those things where it's kind of like an inconsistency where they're trying to put us in the actual universe, but there's certain things that just don't quite add up. And some of them work better than others. This is just like a little throwaway comment, so it's not that big of a deal. But
Right.
yeah, but it was just interesting to hear that.
Yeah, and it's a cute reference for fans who have dug deep enough into these movies to know that that's a reference to a deleted scene. You know, fair play. This is a fan film. There's going to be fan service. They they chat a little bit more while they're digging, and then they're lowering this box. It turns out it is Jason that's in this. It's not a coffin. It's truly just like a almost like a shipping crate. That they lower into the hole, and then the sheriff has to climb down in the hole to try and padlock the chains. And like that's the first thing I would have done before I even loaded this thing into the truck.
No kidding. Yeah, and I was also a little confused because the viewers get a shot inside the crate / coffin that Jason is still alive. Like he's being jostled around, and he's kind of reacting physically to the being jostled around. So I was like, well, do they know that he's not dead, and that's why they're taking all these extra measures to fortify the coffin, or was he dead or pretending to be dead, or whatever Jason does, and he just woke up in this coffin? So I don't know, but yeah, like I'm getting the feeling that, or I'm leaning towards they knew that he was alive, because there was a lot of like, do not open. There's the padlock. There's the chains. There's all these like extra steps that they're taking. So again, I'm going back to the end of like final chapter where he was like pretty fucked up and dead. And so that they just like pick him up. Like, is this like an immediate thing where they like picked him up off the floor of the Jarvis house and put him in this crate and moved off, into the woods? Or is like, as more time passed, did you get an impression of how long it had been?
No, I mean, well, it was weird because like we said, they didn't show him laying on the floor of the Jarvis house. They showed him laying in the woods at the camp. So, I mean, one thing that occurs to me is we never saw the condition that Jason was left in at the end of the final chapter. We saw we saw Trish hit him in the head with the machete, and then he slid down, right? But then Tommy sees his hand twitch and just goes, die. But we never see the after effects of that. We never see just how hacked up Jason is. So, I mean, if he's like, I would have thought he'd be like in pieces at that point. And clearly he's not here. So my guess is just that like the sheriff knows all of the events that have happened since Pam Voorhees went on her rampage. And so he's just kind of deduced that Jason is very hard to kill, permanently kill. And so he's like, I'm not taking any precautions. This guy seems dead, but let's just not take any chances. Except let's leave it unchained until we lower the box into the grave. We'll take that chance. Right. That's the hill I'm going to die on.
Right, and that's what I didn't know, if they knew he was alive in the coffin or if he was dead. Because it's like, well, then why didn't they do all this stuff beforehand?
Right, and yet then why bother doing it at all? And so, I mean, basically what happens is Jason smashes through some of the wood and grabs the sheriff's leg, trying to bust out. But then they just shovel dirt into the hole, and it seems like that stops him. Mm-hmm. So, I mean...
There's a funny comment, though, where the two cops that are with the sheriff, there's like a dude with a beard, and then someone I called Deputy Cutie Pants.
The guy.
Right. The woman had the beard. So, yeah, the sheriff is like in the dug grave, and he's standing on top of the coffin trying to like padlock the chain, and that's when Jason punches through, and instantly the other deputy yells, "You said he was dead!" And I was like I'm not sure if that would have been my first response. Like, I'm not going to be like pointing fingers at people like, "Hey, wait a minute, that's not what you told me before." I'd be like, "Holy fuck."
Right. You'd be doing a spontaneous hot Carl on yourself.
But yeah, I also thought it was weird that scene ended so quickly, like you said, with them just shoveling dirt over the thing, and we're just like, oh, I guess that's all it took. And
yeah, and so I mean, it first occurred to me when we saw the little dictionary definition of the word curse at the beginning, but then we get this shot of them shoveling dirt into the hole, and I'm like, I'm feeling a little bit of a Sam Raimi vibe here, and that continues as we go. There are definitely some influences from the Evil Dead series that we're going to encounter.
Yep. I'll go along with that.
We then bust into the credits, the opening titles, and where we learn that Vincent DiSanti is not only the executive producer, but he's one of the writers of this movie. So his fingerprints are all over this.
We then cut to a cemetery, and a cop car pulls up, and a different sheriff gets out, and he's standing over the grave of someone named Thomas Daltrey, possibly related to Roger Daltrey of The Who. I don't know. But the little inscription on the grave said that he was a beloved father and sheriff of Wessex County. So this is where things get a little confusing, and it took me a while to kind of like piece things together, because this cop that's standing over the grave doesn't look entirely different than the deputy from the previous scene. He looks older. Right. He looks older, but he's not... but you could argue like this is someone playing the older version of the bearded cop from the previous scene. And so I was like, oh, well, there was that bearded guy in the first scene. Was that the son of the sheriff? It doesn't sound like that was the case at all. But there was just a couple of things that make that first scene and then this next scene confusing because of characters that are being introduced. But we do learn that this guy with the beard is the son of of Sheriff Mustache that we saw in the first one. And he's basically, he's just having a conversation with his father and saying that the things are going well at the station. There's not really anything going on in town. It's actually kind of boring. And then he mentions this woman named Eve, who is another deputy that is, according to him, starting to take her job a little bit more seriously. But then we immediately cut to Eve in the patrol car, and she's supposed to be catching speeding drivers, but instead she's reading an issue of Fangoria. I looked it up. This is issue, let's see what it was, issue volume 2, number 5. It talks about Creepshow, which is, I think there was the reimagining of the Creepshow TV show. There's a segment about M. Night Shyamalan and The Lodge, which I think was later changed to Knock at the Cabin. Is that the same movie?
Don't know.
Okay. I think it was, because it's just obviously from like probably 2020 or 21. So probably what it was referencing. And then there's something about Bill Hader and Phil Wolfhard in It. And then there's something about The Lighthouse. And then the last thing, the last little panel on the cover was something called Satanic Panic. And next to it, it said, "Hail Rebecca Romijn." and I was like, what? And so I looked it up, and Satanic Panic was a movie that came out, I think, in 2019, maybe. And it was described as absolutely fun by one IMDb user.
Delightful. Is Rebecca Romijn in it?
Yeah, I think she is. I didn't look at the description of what the movie was about, but
gotcha.
Something about Satan and panic that ensued. But Eve is the other character that made things a little bit confusing, because she looks an awfully lot like the woman from the previous scene. And so it's like, okay, you've got this bearded deputy who's now a sheriff. You've got this brunette cop. And it just took me a minute to realize, no, these are not the same two people. These are just two completely different characters, but just having them right next to each other was a little confusing for me.
Yeah, and it took me a second to realize that this is now supposed to be present day.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't pay close enough attention to the Fangoria cover to see that it's referencing, modern movies. So I thought for a second this was still kind of showing us activities of the era in which like many of the Friday the 13th movies were made. So yeah, it took me a second. I got there, but it was just sort of a little bit disorienting. I agree.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to praise this movie. Like we said, we're watching these in as close to release order as we can, to see if there are trends that we spot, or not necessarily that the fan films are going to respond to each other in any way, but in the previous episode, the most recent one, we talked about how they never showed people actually driving. They would just be sitting in a car having these conversations, and then you'd get an external shot of the car driving away. This is actually a fan film where we see people talking while they're driving. It feels very natural. It feels very much like a movie driving scene would feel.
Yeah, I liked it. And back to what you were saying too, it took me also a second to kind of figure out the time frame of this, because Fangoria was a magazine that had been around for a really long time, and then it went away, and then it got relaunched. So it could have very well been like a vintage Fangoria magazine, which is part of the reason why I paused it on that screen to kind of figure out, like, okay, what is she reading? And it didn't take long to figure out what the cover was. And then I realized, like, okay, so it's more or less present day. But while Eve is sitting in her car, neglecting her duties, she does get a call about a 187, which is a homicide at the corrections farm. And I got a little excited when they first said that, because I thought maybe they were going to Pinehurst. And we'll find out that's not the case. But I was like, oh, that's a nice little reference. I never heard it Pinehurst referred to as a corrections farm, but it absolutely would apply to it. So maybe that was intentional, but
That was also my first thought, but then I immediately discarded that in favor of what I prefer to think, which is more like reform school girls. And I'm like, oh, so maybe it's Jason's penis that's rising. Unlike the dead corrections officer that we next encounter, because he has been murdered in like the barn or whatever, and we see a very clear shot of his penis severed from his body laying on the ground. So it's Officer John Wayne Bobbitt.
Yeah, that shot lingers on the severed dick just a little bit too long, but it is impressive makeup effects. And yeah, there's two U.S. Marshal dudes there, and when the sheriff and Eve show up, one of the U.S. Marshals says, and maybe you can pick up what the connection is here, but the first thing the marshal says is, exactly 47 minutes ago, this guy was killed. I'm like, all right, well, why does that matter? You could have said 45 and it wouldn't have changed the scenario, but it was a very specific number. And I was just wondering, like, is that supposed to mean something to us? Is it reference?
I think that's that if your penis is severed, you have 46 and a half minutes to have it reattached.
Oh.
And so the clock has just expired on this poor bastard.
Oh, that poor guy. He was so close.
He was so close.
It's like if Eve had just taken her job like a little bit more seriously.
Right.
This guy
maybe not finished the article in Fangoria before responding. They could have reattached this poor bastard's penis.
Ugh.
I do like that it was cut off with garden shears, which is a cute little nod to part 5.
Yep.
Another little nod there. And I didn't look to confirm this, but I have to believe that the dickless corpse is like the director cameo or something. If I was making this movie, I would totally Hitchcock myself that way. No pun intended. But
right, yeah, because who's going to audition for that part? You know, it's got to be like, hey, we've got this guy that gets his dick cut off. Who wants to do it? Yeah, the director, the screenwriter, or something. I'd absolutely raise my hand and be like, me, let me do it. We do. So right after we find out that too much time has elapsed for this guy's dick to get reattached, the marshals tell the sheriff and Eve about 3 convicts that have escaped. And I guess they're the ones that are likely responsible for killing this guard. And you joked about reform school girls. This corrections farm really appears to be a prison for or like a correctional facility for women. And
which introduces kind of an unsettling subtext for, they killed this guard to escape, but it seems like they had something, they were out to get him specifically for something genitalia related. So I fear that the implication is that this guard was abusing them or, assaulting them sexually in some way while supposed to be, guarding and caring for them as prisoners. So they had their vengeance.
I thought the same exact thing, and they possibly lured this guy into the barn or wherever he was, and got him into a compromising position, and then either his partner or his sexual partner, or one of the other girls came up and sliced.
Yeah, he was getting the plastic wrap ready, and then they snuck up behind him.
But we learn, so there's the three convicts. There's 3 women, and we get like a very brief description of why they're imprisoned. And one of them is in for 10 years for armed robbery and assault. Another one is in for 15 years for murder of her ex-wife, and another is in for 5 years for hit and run while drunk driving. And I do wish they had leaned more into the introduction of the convicts a little bit, like Con Air, where it's like, his name is Cyrus Grissom, aka Cyrus the Virus. Likes to brag that he killed more men than cancer. Just like really.
Right. We get like a dossier rundown of these 3 ladies. Yeah, I agree.
And like while cutting to shots of them like fleeing in the woods or whatever, just kind of lean into it a little bit. But that was the first thing I thought of when they started introducing them, and then like laying out their rap sheets. I'm like, oh, Con Air did it really well.
That's funny. So the woman hunt begins, and I noticed that we get a lot of sweeping drone shots of the wilderness. Yeah, exactly. Which is a very different language for a Jason movie. We haven't seen a lot of that, in the series historically, because drones didn't exist for much of since this series began being made in 1979. But it also is yet another kind of stylistic choice that makes me think they're referencing Sam Raimi with his swooping camera effects and like the unseen evil, charging through the woods after Ash, things like that.
Yeah, I keep going back and forth about how I feel. We joke about how many drone shots there are, but there really are like at least one drone shot in every one of these fan films, and that's fine. Like it's a cinematic thing to do, but I just feel like doing it just because you can do it doesn't accomplish much. So it's like, I would much rather a drone shot that shows the geography of the camp that they're about to arrive in. So it's like, hey, here's the path in. We've got cabins over here. We've got this mysterious shack up at the top. And then there's a lake over at the right. Just like something like that lays things out. But I feel like 9 times out of 10, these drone shots are only done to just do like a pretty shot. And, every once in a while to be like a car that's like pulling into the woods or something. But like, then they immediately get out of the car and they're in a different location. So it didn't set up anything. It was just this cool shot. And so that, like you were saying with the Evil Dead approach, I would like to see filmmakers try something a little bit different with the with the drones and like utilize it a little bit different. And I think there's that shot at the very beginning where Jason's laying on the ground with the crime scene around him. That would probably normally be a crane shot, and it may very well have been a crane shot in this movie, but it was probably a drone shot. And I was like, okay, that's cool. Like that's a nice perspective. You get to see Jason from above laying on the ground. Totally cool with that. But the ones where it's just kind of like some sweeping vista, I don't know. I think it's more just like filler for me.
Yeah, I think you're right. And you've stumbled upon my single biggest complaint about this particular fan film. It's geographically very confusing. I have no idea, starting from about this point, where anyone is in a relationship to each other or what the structures are that they're entering and leaving constantly. And it just gets very muddled from a layout standpoint. I have no idea, especially once they start splitting up every 10 seconds, who's where and how far away they are from each other. And more adept use of drone footage might, like you say, help have established the environment a little more clearly.
And we do know that Camp Crystal Lake has been closed for a while, but it makes you wonder how long has this corrections facility been right next to a camp where children are. Like, forget Jason, right. You've got this entire facility that's housing criminals. It's like, is that really a great idea to have next to a children's camp?
And obviously violent criminals, regardless of whatever the corrections officer that they murdered did to them, they responded with very intense violence. You wouldn't necessarily want that near Camp Nobi Bosco. We're already introduced to yet another new character, paddling the school canoe, a young hottie enters the woods alone, and it's one of the fugitive's sisters. They have a plan to link up and then paddle away to safety. And she, like some sort of tracking, genius, stumbles upon the marshals that are hunting for her sister and is able to spy on them for a while.
One of the convicts somehow has a cell phone, which I guess she potentially could have stolen from the guard that was murdered, but she's the one that is the first to split off from the other two convicts, and she texts this woman in the canoe from the previous scene to say, come meet me or whatever. And so these two are trying to get together, but like you said, we have no idea how close they are to each other, other than the fact that this non-convict sister sees the U.S. Marshal. So we know they're in the same vicinity. We just don't know exactly where they are yet.
And how hard it's going to be for the marshals to track down these escapees.
Mm-hmm.
We link up with the other two convicts who enter a structure, and I'm not sure if it's supposed to be Jason's shack. I think it's supposed to be one of the Crystal Lake camp cabins, because I think there's some enough other furniture around that it's not his hovel that he lives in. And it turns out that Serena, the first escaped convict with the cell phone, was already hiding there because she rises up behind them with a pillowcase on her head to scare them. Ha 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 ha. And then she tells them the story of Jason, with flashbacks and a kind of a strange-looking version of Pamela Voorhees.
And this is kind of like the first reference to the curse that they allude to at the beginning of the movie. And I kind of like the direction, or at least their motivations here. So the three convicts have hopped this fence into the condemned area of Camp Crystal Lake. And the reason why they did that is because the place is cursed and they don't think anyone's going to find them or follow them in there. So it's really not that much different than the last fan film we watched with the deer.
Right. The deer that hides in the camp.
Right. Yeah. So but again, it's an interesting idea. I liked it in the previous film and I liked it in this one, where it's like, well, okay, at least I understand why they're going there. It's not just them being foolish and saying let's go to this camp. No, nothing's going to happen here. It's like, no, we're going here specifically because we don't think anyone's going to be dumb enough to come follow us. And so I like that kind of umbrella curse where it's not something too, metaphysical. It's just this kind of belief where it's like, we don't go in there. It's just not a great place to be. Right. And they're going to use that as a place to seek out, safety. And so we're like, all right.
It's a good use of the lore. It helps. It helps this story. So, but this kind of flabbergasts me that this has never occurred to me until watching this movie's version of the story of Jason. Why in the hot fuck were counselors expected to watch little Jason while Pam was cooking for the camp? He wasn't a camper. He was just some employee's kid hanging around. So why on earth does she blame counselors for letting him drown? It wasn't their job to babysit him.
Yeah, haven't we seen versions in other official movies and potentially fan films where he was a camper?
The flashbacks in Freddy vs. Jason had him dressed up like he was also a camper, and he was being victimized by by the other kids and stuff. But the version we saw in the flashback of part 1 that they've reused many other times is just this shirtless little Jason floundering in the lake. We don't know if he was, if it was a swimming lesson or if he was just playing in the lake and supposed to have been watched by someone like a lifeguard or something. It's just it's like if someone at my office brought their kid to work, which they shouldn't be doing, and the kid got hurt by, the copier machine falling on him, and then the parent kills me because I wasn't watching their kid. That's fucking bullshit.
Yeah. I can't argue with that. I'm thinking back to all the different versions that we've heard to see. But yeah, I guess every time we get those flashbacks of Jason, he is by himself, with the exception of Freddy versus Jason. He is by himself and he's not part of a larger group of kids. So it's an excellent point. Why was it the counselor's responsibility? But we're also supposed to, you know, Pamela has not exactly proven herself to be the sanest of people. So this could just be her crazy rationale for her poor mothership or motherhood skills.
Right, her neglectful parenting.
Yeah.
We also get a pretty humorous shot of Pamela's head laying on the ground, being found by Jason. After she was beheaded by Adrienne King, and he's wearing this like little Lord of the Flies kind of like outfit made of like some sort of canvas that's tied around his waist and everything, and it made me laugh.
And then this is where shit starts to get a little weird. After the montage with Jason, we start to see various headstones in the woods, and I don't know if those names meant anything to you, Greg, but they certainly didn't mean anything to me. They weren't they weren't anything from previous movies. So I'm guessing they were counselors, and these were just the graves. Why they were buried on the camp, I have no idea. But we kind of scatter around, show a handful of different headstones, and then we get to Pamela Voorhees, and it's the same thing with her, birth and death on there. But then a hand punches out of the ground, and a headless zombie Pamela Voorhees is now walking around the camp.
Right. So now we're on full-blown Sam Raimi territory. That was a swerve, to say the least.
What was your initial reaction when you saw it?
My initial reaction was, oh, somebody just watched Evil Dead 2.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's no denying that there's Sam Raimi influences all over it. But my first, I guess, hope was that this was just like a dream sequence and not actually happening. And we'll get to this as she makes further appearances in the movie, but yeah, I couldn't decide if I was annoyed by what I was seeing or if I thought it was cool, because I was like, all right, I'm just going to wait and see, because maybe this is just some weird dream sequence, hallucination or something like that. But wasn't a huge fan of seeing zombie Pamela Voorhees.
No, I mean, yeah, my reaction was sort of similar. It was, immediately like I said, laughing at the Raiminess of it, and then thinking, oh, well, maybe it's a dream sequence, but I mean, we'll see where they're going with this. I can't think of a scenario where I'm going to wind up liking where they go with this, but okay, let's see what they do with it. And I mean, in pretty short order, we established that it's really not a dream sequence, because we cut back to Hottie McSisterpants, and she finds Jason's grave, and she's kind of gazing at this headstone. She hears a creepy child's voice, and then she's hammered by Headless Pam. So I mean, Headless Pam is physically walking around, somehow got a hold of a hammer and smacks this sister with it, and then punches through the ground to drag Jason's box out by the chain, freeing him and giving him a machete. Okay.
And this is where I was wondering, because like they made such a point to bring up curse. It's the very first thing that pops up on the screen for this movie is a definition. So I thought, is there something mystical happening in the confines of this fenced-in area that is causing people to see things that aren't really there? And so I was still thinking that up until the point where Pamela Voorhees shows up with this cute sister, and thought, oh, she's going to has this vision of Mrs. Voorhees with no head, and it's going to freak her out. But then when there's like a physical manifestation of her, like Pamela Voorhees killing the sister, I'm like, oh, okay, well, this is no longer a curse. This is like, this person is there. Like, this headless zombie Pamela is there. And it really bugged me. I don't know. It just wasn't something I was expecting to see, at least so soon in this particular movie.
Yeah, like I know what you mean. Like, the idea of a curse should feel a little more metaphysical, and this is literally just like, oh, now it's a reanimated, corpse wandering around. So it makes things too tangible to be a true curse. There's no dread. It's just like, what the fuck am I watching? Serena, the convict, sneaks out while the other two inmates are sleeping in the cabin to meet up with her sister, who she unfortunately finds laying in the hole where Jason had been buried. And Jason is there, hanging out too, who starts chasing her through the woods down to the lake. She jumps into the abandoned canoe that her sister brought and tries to paddle to safety, but she's not fast enough because it's hard to paddle quickly when you're being pursued by a maniac. He grabs the canoe's tow line and pulls her back to shore, giving her a chance to smack him with a log, which knocks his mask off. But then he lurches out of the water nearby, Part 1 style, and it fades to white. So we get a nice reference to the end of Part 1.
We then cut away really quickly to somewhere else at Camp Crystal Lake, and the sheriff and one of the U.S. Marshals have arrived, and Deputy Eve is taking a leak in the woods when she gets a call from the sheriff to meet them at one of the cabins. And then we cut back really quickly to Serena, the convict, who has actually managed to crawl away from Jason on the lakeshore, but Jason's right behind her, and he rams his machete through the back of her head, and it comes out of her mouth for a pretty solid effect.
Yeah, I thought that was a pretty good kill. And then it's dark again. And so the other confusing thing for me about this movie is that I think at this point a whole night and day has passed, because earlier Serena mentioned that there were only 2 hours left until the sun went down, and it was already feeling pretty dark. And yet here it's broad daylight, where she's just been killed by her canoe. And so then in the next scene, it's dark again. So, I mean, I feel like more than 24 hours has passed at this point.
No, I noticed that too. I think it's more of just like an editing mistake, because I know the scene you're talking about when the three convicts are in the cabin right after Serena scares them with the mask or whatever. It does seem very, very dark outside, and I probably was when they were filming it. And I was confused too, because then you cut away and it's broad daylight. Yeah, I don't know. I'm going to lean more toward just kind of an inconsistency in editing rather than that much passage of time, because that just seems like a really long time for them to, like, these 3 or 4 people to be out there. So,
oh, I agree.
Yeah.
It's just, it didn't line up
No.
with my mental tracking of the lighting and stuff. So
Yeah, it was confusing. So Eve and the sheriff begin searching the cabins, and Eve scares the sheriff with a hockey mask that's reminiscent of the one scene in some of the posters for Part 5, which I thought was kind of cool. It's just like a quick, like, whee, and just jump scare. And Eve thinks it's hilarious, and then sheriff calls her a real Amy Schumer, like sarcastically. So I was like, ouch.
Yeah, taking heat on Amy Schumer in this movie.
Right. And I think this is where it like cuts away to Jason returning to his shack, and he's listening to the decapitated head of his mother telling.
Right, we get yet another, Mrs. Voorhees talking to him through her severed head.
Yep.
I'm like, okay.
Make them pay for what they did to you.
Oy. One of the marshals, meanwhile, has found Jason's box, which is, of course, empty because he's smashed out of it. The other 2 inmates are lurking nearby. So even though they all can't find each other, they happen to be very close together. They're in close proximity to each other. The 2 inmates separate, and the older one gets a hatchet to the forehead, and then she's decapitated by Jason's machete.
One thing I'm learning from these Friday the 13th movies and the fan films as well is that don't ever lean up against a tree in the woods by yourself. Just don't, because it never, ever ends well.
No. Ralph got it that way. The dude in Part 5, Eddie, got it that way. Yeah, no, just never back yourself up against a tree. You don't know what's on the other side.
Yep.
We get one quick moment of the 2 U.S. Marshals reuniting with an unnecessary scare. There's also a lot of scenes of people startling each other, even though they're all heavily armed in this movie, which to me seems like a bad idea.
Very bad. I would never, ever do that, because a lot of times they think it's funny that they're startling them. Sometimes they're doing it unintentionally, but I'm like, Jesus Christ, if you're hunting for someone, don't sneak up on them.
Right. The younger of the 2 inmates has now tripped and hurt her leg, And then we see Jason appear, but this time he's wearing the sack over his hockey mask. That didn't make a lot of sense to me.
No. And I desperately wanted him to like pull off the sack. He's wearing the hockey mask. And he pulls off the hockey mask and he's wearing like something different. And he just keeps like pulling off these masks until he gets to his face. But yeah, I was like, what is he doing? Like there's better ways of like getting Sackhead Jason in this movie. Like, why does he have to be wearing the hockey mask underneath the sack? And why would he feel the need to take the sack off before he kills this woman?
Right. Yeah, I mean, that was just like a moment that they just, oh, well, let's have Sackhead Jason in it for a second. Well, how are we going to do that? I don't know. He's just wearing it.
It's like Uber Jason under the hockey mask. It's like, wait, how did this happen?
And then ultimately, it's the coroner from Jason Goes to Hell underneath all of this, and we're like, fuck!
He's still chewing on a heart.
Yeah. She tries to roll away, but she's hacked to death by a big axe, apparently.
There's a bunch of running around with the two marshals and Eve and the sheriff, and like they're finding clues that something's going on. I think they see a blood trail. They find at least one of the bodies. There's a second body that they don't show us, but I think we're supposed to believe it's one of the convicts.
Right. They all briefly reunite and then they split up again. This part of the movie started to feel a lot to me like the lengthy sequence in part 7 where people are running in and out of the woods and back inside, and you don't know why people are where they are, and it starts to get really garbled here.
There is a cool scene between the two marshals where the big dude, I call him Marshal Badass, he has his sights on Jason, and he's tracking him like Mac was tracking the Predator. He's like, out there past them trees. It's like, right. And it's like they're both kind of like huddled behind a tree, and the marshal has him like literally in his sights of his machine gun. But again, we don't really get an idea of how close they are to each other. But I just like the idea that, and we've mentioned this in previous episodes, I just like when a character gets the jump on Jason for a change, and it's like, I'm watching you and you don't know it yet. So I'm kind of a sucker for those kind of scenes, but the first thing I thought of was Predator with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I mean, they're trying to like flush Jason out of hiding, and so they come up with this little scheme that they've used before called the pisser, where the smaller, like the goofier one of this duo of marshals, announces loudly like, well, before we move on, I'm going to go over here and take a piss, and starts to, I think, actually start urinating in the shrubbery. And we expect Jason to come out of nowhere and attack him, but instead it's actually Pam's headless corpse that has still been just wandering around. So that was not the direction I thought they were going to go with this. Now there's two maniacs, one of which has a head and one of which does not.
In one of the cutback scenes with Sheriff and Eve, we learned that the sheriff's father, which we already kind of hinted at the beginning of this episode, the sheriff's father is Sheriff Mustache, who helped bury Jason somewhere in the camp. And I think he even says that, but he wasn't dead. So maybe they did know that he wasn't dead, or maybe they just know now that he wasn't dead. But the Sheriff Mustache was the one who wrote "Do Not Open" on the coffin. So like starting to piece things together, we're like, because I think one of the marshals calls ahead and says that they found this coffin or they found a box. They don't know what it is, but it says "Do Not Open" on there. And then the sheriff's like, oh shit, I remember my dad telling me the story. I never really believed him, but it sounds like this might be the real deal.
Yeah, the marshals then split up again, and Bear, the large one that's armed with the laser sight, is searching through the fog, the mists, for his target, and winds up, encountering Pam and unloads on her, fills her headless body with lead. But then suddenly Jason is there, and unfortunately for Bear, his gun has jammed, so they resort to having a punch fight. I thought this was going to go in the same direction as the boxer from Part 8, but after exchanging a few hits, he winds up getting hacked in half by Jason's machete. And then in another Predator reference, Jason reaches down and pulls this man's entire spinal column out in one piece.
Jason was a total dick here because this Marshall, he's a big dude, and when Jason realizes that his gun is jammed or out of ammo or whatever it was, Jason actually drops the machete and was like, okay, look, you don't have a weapon. I don't have a weapon. Let's do this.
Right.
And they kind of tango for not very long, maybe like 10 or 15 seconds. And then, like you said, Jason picks the machete back up and just decides to kill the Marshal. We're like, well, that's not cool. Like
Yeah. Stick to the rules, Jason.
Yeah. You said he was dead.
Right. The other Marshal arrives, and his arm is hacked off by Jason's machete, and then he is bludgeoned to death with the skull and spine of his former comrade.
Oh, I thought it was his arm.
You might be right. I thought it was the skull and the spine. Either way, it's pretty awesome to use a body part to kill someone.
Exactly. Yeah, I thought it was just more hilarious that he like literally got beaten to death with his own arm that got chopped off. But yeah, it's just as insulting if it was the spine and skull of your partner. At this point, Jason has done enough good deeds that kind of a MILF version of Pamela shows up to praise him for all of his work so far. But she basically says his work's not done because there's still the two cops left, the sheriff and Eve. And that's when we cut back to the sheriff, and he's been illuminating the campground with some flares that he or has with him. And Jason shows up, and this gets really confusing because I thought this guy got killed like 10 times in the last 20 minutes of this movie. But Jason shows up and injures the sheriff really badly, but he's able to run away and warn Eve before he collapses on the ground.
Right. So now it's just down to her being pursued by Jason, and she finds a shack, and I'm pretty sure this is Jason's hovel, because it's got his collection of heads and shit. So she barricades herself wisely behind and reinforces the door. So Jason starts pounding on the outside trying to get in, and she kind of crawls through a pile of bodies to be able to hide in a crawl space under the floor. And I thought that was resourceful.
I just couldn't figure out how she got to John Wayne Gacy's house.
In Chicago?
Yep.
Nice.
Just to make it even more geographically confusing.
Yeah, right, exactly. And then we get another little interlude, a brief little interlude of someone listening to a police radio and picking up the deputy's panicked transmissions. But it's a sunny house where someone is painting while drinking Chardonnay. This person then hops into an SUV, presumably to go offer assistance.
Then we go back to Jason's shed where Eve is still hiding under the floorboards, and Jason has somehow found his way inside, which is fine. It's his place. I'm sure he has his means, but I just would have liked to have seen him get in there somehow.
Like bash through the front door. I mean, maybe he just had like a key under a fake rock.
Right.
We do get a pretty good shot of him through the, looking up through the floorboards, of him kind of peering through the slats, and then, kind of backing out of frame. So we're pretty sure he knows where she's hiding. It was a good Jason moment.
And then we get our first indication that the sheriff was not killed. Eve finds that he's been badly wounded, and she's trying to get him to leave, but he's in pretty bad shape. And suddenly we hear the sound of a motor starting in the background. And I had a couple of thoughts here when I heard the motor. My hope was that it was some sort of lawn tool, like a weed whacker or something like that, going back to, part 7 or something like that. But I was really, really disappointed when he came out of the darkness wielding a chainsaw.
I was hoping it was going to be Bruce Campbell showing up as Ash, complete with groovy. So I, too, was very disappointed when it turned out to just be Jason wielding a chainsaw, which we've never seen Jason wielding a chainsaw in these movies, despite the fact that, kind of just in popular references, out in the world, people often talk about, a chainsaw-wielding hockey-masked killer, but Jason never used a chainsaw. That's always been Leatherface's thing.
Yeah, it just kind of bugged me. I mean, obviously there's no rule that says he can't have a chainsaw, but like you said, I just associate the chainsaw with Leatherface, and that's just kind of his thing. And so when you see Jason with it, we've seen Jason use so many other tools effectively that I don't know if I necessarily wanted to see him go to town with a chainsaw. It's just not like I was fine with never having seen Jason with a chainsaw. Let's put it that way.
Right. It was never something I was wishing I would get. And he's only okay with it. He does manage to saw off the sheriff's gun hand, which was a pretty good shot. But he loses control of the chainsaw, and Eve manages to get it and runs him through. So I mean, he's pretty carved up.
Mm-hmm. Which was kind of like a redeeming thing for me because I did not want to see an extended sequence of Jason running around with a chainsaw. So like it was brief. He kind of proved that he was inept at using it because he doesn't hold on to it for very long. He only manages to chop off the fingers or whatever of the sheriff. So he's not great with it. But again, where did he get it from? Did he pick it up earlier and he's been carrying it, or was it just already laying in the woods nearby?
Right. How well has he been maintaining it?
Yeah. Has he been oiling it properly?
Oil the bar. Yeah. I mean, it's opens too many questions. This, of course, has made headless Pamela Voorhees very unhappy. So she goes and finds his shack and at this point puts her head back on her body. It's mummified. I don't even think there are eyeballs in the eye sockets. So she really is just like this undead creature of evil now.
Did we see, and I may have already forgotten, like what brought her back to life in the first place?
I think we just got that weird dream sequence where her hand kind of, plunges out of the ground at her gravesite.
Right.
I don't think that there was anything specific that brought her back. Like there was no inciting moment that like a lightning bolt or, someone, performing a ritual or something. It was sort of just like people showing up in the campground.
That's what I'm wondering. If it's just kind of like, which is what, Jason's MO, which is just the presence of people on the property was enough to awaken her and like, okay, fine, I'll buy it. I'm not going to argue with that. But I was just trying to think what awoken her in the first place and why wasn't her first order of business to put her head back on?
Yeah, why? Now she's mad. Now right. She's going to put her head back on.
Now I'm going to see what I'm doing.
Right. I think it's because what they have planned for the final scenes of this movie require enough of, like, they need someone to perform, the stunts and actions of Pamela Voorhees with a head because you can't erase a person's head. So they're just like, well, now she puts the head back on.
Right.
We cut back to the security barn at the Department of Corrections camp, where we see our friend Vincent DeSanti sitting at a desk reading an old issue of Playboy and watching Axel's workout video from Part 4.
I think it's even the same issue that Axel was reading in the final chapter, because it was
that would make sense.
Because I want our listeners to be informed, so I did some digging to figure out as much as I possibly could about this particular issue of Playboy. It was July 1980. You could get it for $2.50. The contents were Playboy's Fearless Guide to Sun, Sand, and Surf. And this next one is just, it's like ripped from the current headlines. It's absolutely something you would see today. Dudley Moore searches for another 10. There's a Bruce Jenner interview, which I'm sure that went well. There's a Maui Wowie, Maui's most voluptuous views. There's classy duds for saucy summer nights. Plus, how to stay ahead of a staggering economy. My favorite part, though, is just, again, it's the nice little time capsule, but the back cover of the Playboy had an ad for Winston Lights cigarettes. And the tagline says, Winston Lights didn't compromise on great taste to get low tar. Why should I? Winston Lights tastes good like a light cigarette should. But you can buy a near mint condition of this magazine for like $50 on eBay if you're interested. So
$50?
Yeah.
Jesus, I hope the pages aren't stuck together.
Only in the Dudley Moore interview section.
Deputy Eve and the injured sheriff have now made it back to the barn for assistance, but almost immediately the power is cut, and we switch over to like red alert lighting on the USS Enterprise.
And then we hear the chainsaw noise outside. So Deputy DeSanti decides to go investigate, despite Eve saying, "Stay inside, you idiot. What are you doing?" But DeSanti opens the door and gets run through with the chainsaw, which is now wielded by the head reattached zombie version of Pamela Voorhees. But the favorite part of this is just DeSanti's reaction to the kill. And he knows exactly what he's doing. It's completely over the top. It's very Sam Raimi, where he's just kind of like shaking. And I think he says something like, "Please, God, no," as he's being like vibrated to death by the chainsaw. So, and it goes on like just a little too long. But again, I think it's on purpose, but it did crack me up.
Yeah, so she's basically laying waste to everyone in this barn. More hands go flying. Bullets are not stopping her. It seems like she is undefeatable. Until someone arrives wearing a yellow raincoat. It turns out that it's Alice Hardy. She has returned. And she, as she did once before many years ago, cuts Pam's head off again. So Alice Hardy is still alive and has now repeated the actions at the end of part 1 by decapitating Pamela Voorhees. And she even says, "I never thought I'd have to do that again."
Yeah, and there's a few pieces that kind of fill in some gaps here a little bit later, so I'm not going to get into too much detail about what's happening here. But after she decapitates Mrs. Voorhees again, she tells the cops that she heard the distress call and that she lives nearby and that she thought she would help. But as soon as she says that, I think the door like bursts open or something, and Jason is standing there. And there's a really cool, very quick moment, but Alice turns around and sees Jason and she just goes, "The boy."
Yeah, I loved that.
I absolutely loved it. And it's just like the subtlest little reference to what she says, obviously, at the end of part 1, where, you know, she's telling the cops who pulled her into the lake, and the cop responds, "We never found any boy." But it was just kind of this, I don't know, this nice reaction of like, I was right. And this, I feel like this gets undercut in a little bit with something that we learn. But I did like her initial reaction, because even like the way she said it was exactly the same as like the first one. Mm-hmm. And it was just kind of a nice, because this is, as far as in terms of the fan films that we've watched, this is the first appearance of Alice in anything outside of part 1 and part 2 that we've seen. So it was really cool to see her come back and then have her reference something like that. It was just a nice little moment. Like, okay, you capitalized on her appearance. I'm happy with this.
Yeah, and it makes sense that that's how she would think of Jason, as the boy. So yeah, I really liked that moment a lot. Jason sees his mother's head laying on the ground yet again, which causes him to attack. But he's defeated by Alice wielding an ice pick,
which she has like a handy holder for, like strapped across her chest.
Yeah, like this is her weapon of choice.
Yeah.
And I think we'll come back to that detail in a bit. I think we'll wait until kind of our wrap-up discussion to discuss my thoughts about the ice pick in this scene. I'm always happy to see Adrienne King. She's awesome. I love the detail that she was drinking wine while painting, because she is an artist and also has a winery, or at least a wine label that she's a part of, that I, as we've discussed, I purchased for you for your 40th birthday, and we drank at the end of when we finished the reboot mm-hmm. recording, I believe, yep. in celebration. So I was happy to see her, and yeah.
As she's leaving, the sheriff and Eve are obviously like, "Who the fuck are you?" But she just basically says that she has a history with the Voorhees family, and that her father, or the sheriff's father, helped her out in a time of need. And again, there's something that comes up a little bit later that kind of fills in this blank. But when she first said it, I'm going back. I'm like, wait a minute, is Sheriff Mustache like was he an actual character in one of the older movies? And I like went back on IMDb to see what his character name was, to see if he was maybe supposed to be the cop that was in the hospital with her at the end of part 1 or whatever the case is. No, it's something completely different that again we'll learn about in a second. But it was a little muddy the way this was kind of like unpacked, and so I wasn't able to kind of like just sit back and enjoy the moment. I was kind of like sitting forward and being like, well, wait a minute, wait, what? Who is this?
Trying to parse.
Yeah.
Agreed. No, it's clearly not that the sheriff was Sergeant Tierney, but like you, I was wondering if this was like a reference to a pre-established character, much like how we found out after the fact that Officer Dorff wound up in one of these fan films. So yeah, I was in the same position you were. She has taken Pam's head and drives away. We get a brief scene of Jason's box and mask as they are being sunk to the bottom of Crystal Lake. So presumably he's been reinterred in this box, and they are burying him beneath the waves of Crystal Lake.
Why did they throw the mask on top of the box when they were pushing it into the lake? Like,
not really sure.
Like either keep the mask altogether or just throw it in the box with the body. But it was just kind of weird. Like,
right. Or like smash it up and throw it in the garbage or something. Yeah.
And then we cut to a scene of Deputy Eve back at the police station, and she's going through some files, and she finds one under the witness protection section, and it's Alice. And I had to pause it to kind of look at it, but the details of the report suggest that she survived the screwdriver attack at the beginning of part 2. So that answered a question that I had immediately when Alice showed up. I'm like, wait, we're told that this is taking place in the actual Friday the 13th universe, but Alice died, so how is she still around? And basically, she survived that, which I guess is possible. Like, we never saw the aftermath. She got the ice pick in the head, and then we didn't see anything. I don't even think we saw her on the ground. So I guess it's possible that she was still alive. And then,
but we saw in Jason's shed.
Oh, fuck, you're right.
There was a skeleton with an ice pick in its head that was clearly meant to be Alice.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Shit. I was all ready to defend it.
So, well, there's another detail coming up that I think is their attempt to explain some of this, but we'll get there. So, yes, you've established that Alice was taken into the protection of the witness relocation program.
Okay.
And yet she's within driving distance of Camp Crystal Lake.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Also on the report where it's kind of like the autopsy report where they show all the wounds, it says that she got a therapeutic needle puncture in her right buttock. And I'm wondering if that was kind of like maybe an adrenaline shot or something, or it just something that brought her back. I don't know what it would have been. Maybe it was even kind of like an anti-anxiety thing. Like maybe the cops found her and she was losing her mind because of what just happened. And they're like, we got to calm her down before we can get her in the ambulance or whatever. But it was like, those are the two wounds that were listed, were the ice pick to the head and a therapeutic needle puncture to the right buttock. And it's like, all right.
So like that scene in Pulp Fiction where they have to revive Uma Thurman because she's taken too much of like the heroin laced cocaine or whatever.
Yeah. The only other thing I thought, and this was just me creating my own headcanon, is like maybe Alice has diabetes and she like gave herself like an injection before she obviously got ice picked. But I don't know. It was just a weird detail where I'm like, why was this included? Why is there like a therapeutic needle puncture in her butt?
Right, and they're so specific with which cheek that it went into.
Yeah.
But we're back at Alice's house where she gets a phone call that goes to the answering machine from Dr. Ginny Field. And it actually is Amy Steele, which I was pleasantly surprised by. I thought maybe it was, and when I checked the credits, she did make a brief appearance for this little voice-only role. But I thought it was odd that she introduced herself on the message as Dr. Ginny Field. I mean, clearly they have this pre-existing therapeutic relationship, And I mean, my shrink never referred to himself by his full name and title. He would always just say like, "Hey, man, it's blah." So that was a little bit stilted and formal, I
It
thought.
felt very odd to me too, especially since before you start to hear the audio of her leaving the message, you see Ginny's picture pop up on the phone. So like we
Right.
can connect the dots. Like it says Dr. Field and it's a picture of Amy Steele. It's like we got it. But then when she says
Yeah.
Dr. Ginny Field, yeah, it would be like, "Oh, hi Dr. Ginny Field. This is Alice Hardy. How are you?"
Right. I'm Dr. Ginny Field, PhD in psychology, and how are you today?
My right
Um,
butt cheek hurts.
she makes reference to hoping that the new medications are helping Alice deal with the hallucinations. And that's the detail that I think they are trying to use to explain the discrepancy between Alice being killed in part two and her being alive in this movie. I'm not sure how far it's supposed to go, though, because, like we mentioned, she defeats Jason in this movie with an ice pick. So clearly, the ice pick was important to her in some way. You wouldn't choose that as your backup weapon unless you had used it before for some reason. So, like you say, was she in fact stabbed with the ice pick and managed to survive? In which case, how do you explain the skeleton that has the ice pick in its head in Jason's shack? Or did she hallucinate that whole thing? Which would explain, like, how did Jason know her phone number and all that kind of stuff. Um, so I feel like they're maybe picking and choosing details to go with, and what to ignore when it comes to the continuity of this series. Um, but I sort of took that to mean that she has struggled with hallucinations after the traumatic events of part one, and that maybe anything that we saw pertaining to Alice in any other episodes was intended to just be like her hallucinating her own fate.
Yeah, I had completely forgot about the head with the ice pick in it because that's kind of like that just proves the theory wrong right from the beginning that she did not die, but she was hallucinating. There's the before we get to the shot of Alice's phone ringing and we see that it's Doctor or that is Ginny. There are two prescription bottles of olanzapine, and I looked it up, and it says it helps to manage symptoms of mental health conditions such as seeing, hearing, feeling, or believing things that others do not, feeling unusually suspicious or having muddled thoughts, in parentheses, schizophrenia, feeling agitated or hyperactive, very excited, elated, or impulsive, mania symptoms of bipolar disorder. So that supports you. And there's also a book that she's reading called Transformed by Trauma: Stories of Post-Traumatic Growth, which you can get for $15.99 on Amazon. But if in fact she's hallucinating these things and she never did get killed by Jason with the ice pick, then why did she have to go? Why did the police have to go through the lengths of creating a witness protection report that said that she was killed by someone with an ice pick to the head and was
Right.
dead? Like it's unnecessary. Like Jason's not going to get fooled by that if he comes across that case file. He'd be like,
If he can even read it.
right. He's going to look at it. Well, he's going to see the drawings and he's like, "Oh, did I do that?" But yeah, like it just doesn't add up. I liked the idea of her surviving it and being in witness protection, but then there's all these other things that contradict that and say that maybe that wasn't the case. Maybe she's hallucinating all this stuff and it never happened to begin with. And then it's kind of this endless cycle of like, well, then why was she in witness protection? Like, who are they trying to fool? Like by convincing someone, Jason or whoever, that she was
Right.
dead.
Right. Unless they expected that Mrs. Voorhees would rise from the grave, find her own head, reattach it to her shoulders, and then begin investigating medical records and police reports in the surrounding area to track down the person who had temporarily decapitated her.
It's possible. I'm not going to rule that out. It's certainly plausible, and yeah, it's just good on the cops for considering that as a possibility. And they're like, hey, you know what? That headless zombie Pamela Voorhees may come into this police station one day and go through our files. So let's bait her with this whole bullshit story about Alice. But yeah, it's like, I don't hate it. I don't love it. I just feel like there's a couple of holes in it that I don't know if we can necessarily resolve. But bottom line, it was great to see Alice again.
Yes, and briefly Ginny, but yes, particularly Adrienne King. That was great. We get a quick shot of her placing Pamela's head in a straw-lined box, so she's being sealed away, under Alice's guard at her own home. So, I mean, my thoughts on this, like, we've spoken, we've had the opportunity to speak briefly with Vincent DiSanti, and he struck me as an intelligent person. Like, he's clearly no moron. He's clearly put a lot of thought into his love of this series and the fan films that he's made. So I have a feeling that, like, maybe they're going somewhere with this, and maybe these questions that we have and these holes that we think we have found will be explained somewhere else along the line, because I can't imagine that he would not have thought of them or gloss over them. We'll see. I mean, I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt based on my impressions of him as a fan. We get a quick kind of mid-credits scene of Jason striding out of the lake. So he's freed himself from his box. He puts his mask back on, and then he peers across the lake to a pretty nice-looking house on the hillside overlooking Crystal Lake. I'm pretty sure that's meant to be Alice's house. So again, if she's in the witness relocation program, now she's living on the lake where all this happened. Like, that seems like a strange choice.
Right. Not the greatest protection program. So where are we going to put you? Well, we're just going to put you right across the lake from Camp Crystal Lake. And
yeah, that's like putting Henry Hill across the street from Paul Sorvino's, convenience store or whatever in Goodfellas. Like, that doesn't make any sense.
And by the way, we're not going to change your name because your psychiatrist calls you Alice. So
right.
Right. So nothing's really changing. We're just going to have this one piece of paper in a manila folder in the police station. Yeah, I agree. I'll absolutely give the filmmakers the benefit of the doubt that they're setting something bigger up. The fact that all of this kind of is uncovered at the very end of the movie certainly, to me, feels like a cliffhanger more than like a, oh shit, that's awesome. It's like setting something else up to move forward with. And Alice, when she's back in the house in the previous scene, when she's putting the head in the little box or whatever it is, she says payback's a bitch. And I couldn't quite figure out what the payback was, because she's already killed her once. So, like, that's, as far as I'm concerned, payback has been achieved. And then she came back and got killed again. I don't know if that's still considered payback or again, if she's alluding to something that she's about to do that we haven't seen yet.
Right. So what I wish is that, she places Pam's head in this little box. I wish that they had shown, like, some plastic wrap laying nearby. And so the payback was going to be like an endless stream of hot Carls done on Pamela's severed head for the next 5 years. And we've brought it all back around again.
I've been Brian. Hey, why not? We've already proven that Alice is maybe not in the greatest mental space. So this is what she has planned for.
Whatever floats your boat, right. whatever floats your canoe at this stage of the series.
The hot Carls also don't always float. Sometimes they just sink right to the bottom.
Wow. This podcast has taken a turn. Seeing Adrienne King back kind of made me start thinking about this upcoming Brian Fuller TV series. And what I really hope it's not is a legacy sequel to part one only, much like the recent David Gordon Green Halloween movies are a sequel only to the very first John Carpenter Halloween movie. I don't want this new series to ignore everything that's happened with Jason and the hockey mask and even going to Manhattan. Like, I hope that they don't create some new alternate timeline to explain how Adrienne King can be involved in this series.
Yeah, we still, as of recording, don't really know what the direction is, but it does make you wonder, now that we're starting to see Alice pop back up, if there really are going to be any attempts to rewrite things, because just because we're being told that the TV show is a prequel, I don't think we've really been told what where the story begins, or necessarily where the story ends. So it could be a prequel to Pamela Voorhees going crazy. It could be a prequel to, like you said, Alice getting killed by Jason in part 2. Yeah, I don't know. We'll see. But as far as bringing Alice back into the fold, I thought this was a pretty solid version of it. I don't know if I would have wanted to see an entire movie of Alice being the main character and going off trying to chase Jason. At least not in this movie. I didn't want to see that, but it was fun seeing her show up at the end in a quick role, have some nice lines, and it got a little muddy. Not entirely sure what the motivations were there, but I didn't hate it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as far as fan films go, I enjoyed their use of Alice. It was happy and a fun surprise. They didn't necessarily set it up with enough lead time for me to get truly excited. It seemed like they just introduced this off-camera character, and then moments later we find out it's Alice. So I don't know that it was built up as effectively as it could have been. But in terms of this being made by non-professionals or semi-professionals, it was great. That was a fun surprise.
Mm-hmm. For me, I would say you take out the headless zombie Pamela Voorhees, and I would put this fan film at or near the top of the ones that we've seen so far. I thought it was really competently made. I liked the story. The characters were pretty decent, but I just felt like the zombie Pamela was just such a tonal shift from the rest of the movie that it just didn't quite add up. Like if you're going to introduce that character like that, like I'll buy into it, but I feel like the rest of the movie has to kind of be in on the joke and either like responding accordingly. Like if they see it and they're like, what the fuck? Like we didn't really get a lot of that. It was just like they were seeing Jason or just any other person. There wasn't any kind of reaction or even like ramifications to what they were seeing. It was just there to create this weird thing that was running around, and it's like I don't know if we needed that in addition to Jason. Like just have Jason running around, or have people, which is something I mentioned earlier, if there is this like curse that kind of looms over the area, maybe it infects the people that are in there and they're hallucinating things, and each of these characters is maybe seeing something different based on what their fears are. And so maybe one person is seeing a headless Pamela Voorhees, or maybe one's seeing a little Jason running around, or just something where it's like everything that I've heard about this story is starting to infect my mind and freak me out and create this terrifying experience for me, in addition to the fact that Jason is actually coming after me. But when they made headless zombie Pamela a tangible figure that's also walking around the woods, I was just like, I don't know if I like that.
Yeah, agreed. I would have liked it. I would have gone with it a lot more if they had leaned into it. Maybe even having her be the only threat in this movie. The fact that she was just this like secondary threat, it didn't lean into it hard enough. And I think that's. I have issues with the concept, but I would have enjoyed it a lot more if it had just been like balls to the wall, even more like Raimi stylistic touches, and just make it crazy balls, because that's kind of where it wants to go. And like you say, no one ever addresses it in the story itself. It's just like, oh, okay, there's a headless person wandering around. So yeah, I think that's my biggest disappointment. I enjoyed this overall. I do think some of the geographical confusion and the constant reuniting and splitting up got a little bit tedious for me. I would have liked to see larger sections of this movie cut down so that it would be even shorter than it already was. But I had fun watching this one, and I was looking forward to talking about it with you.
Yeah, me too. I think the you talked about leaning into it a little bit more. I think that final scene, or one of the final scenes in the police barn or whatever that is, where the reconstituted Pamela Voorhees shows up and she's like, blah! Like that was like, okay, like that's kind of crazy enough that I'm okay with that. Like that, that's kind of like that bonkers shit that I wouldn't mind seeing more of. But because I think everyone in that scene kind of knew how crazy that was. And it was like, okay, then we're all having fun here. This is great. But when they were, all the stuff leading up to that was what I had like, I wouldn't say a big problem with, but I just didn't really love it as much. But overall, yeah, I thought the movie was fun. I liked it.
The next time we get together, we're going to cover Here Comes the Night Part 2. So in preparation of that, give our previous episode covering Here Comes the Night Part 1 a re-listen to catch you up on where things stand with that little sub-series. So yeah, stay tuned for more.
Absolutely. So if you're looking for recommendations on the best saran wrap to use for your hot Carls, you'll just have to tune in next time for the next episode of You're All
Doomed.